and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Good morning and welcome to a very special episode of Saturday Morning with Esther and Phil, in which we play an exclusive interview with John Bercow throughout the show.
The former Speaker of the House of Commons spoke to us about his time in office, why he made the decisions he did during Brexit, his journey from right to left, how much influence his wife Sally had over his decisions, and accusations of bullying brought against him. It's certainly not one to miss. And join us in the studio to dissect the interview is political broadcasting legend Michael Crick.
And to get straight to the interview with former Speaker of the House of Commons, here it is, John Bercow.
And remember, we want to hear from you today, so let us know your thoughts. Email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk.
And during the interview, we spoke to John Bercow about Brexit, his decision to ban Donald Trump from speaking in Parliament, and accusations of bullying made against him. But we started by asking him if he'd always wanted to get into politics.
John, thank you for agreeing to do the interview. I describe you as a political animal. Did you always want to be an MP?
Pretty much always. At the age of 9, I stood at Frith Manor School in a school election on a manifesto of opposition to the appalling quality of school meals. I was bearded by the dinner ladies for my outspoken critique. I didn't advance an argument for compulsory competitive tendering, market testing or privatisation, but I did have a fairly populist, you'll be familiar with the concept, Philip, populism, opposition to those school meals. So I was quite political at that point, as in argumentative. The local press said I had a strong platform manner. And then from 15 or 16, I became determinedly political. And there were two factors. It was the state of the country, streets unswept, sick people untreated, dead people unburied, and the sense that the unions were running the show. That was the negative that propelled my interest. And the positive was that I went to school in Margaret Thatcher's constituency. I went to hear her speak, I met her afterwards and was inspired. And so the rest is history. So that's a roundabout way of saying pretty much always. For a very short period of about 3 months in 1983, I flirted with the idea of becoming an academic. But really from 16 onwards, I always wanted one day to be a member of Parliament. I never had any aspiration at that point to be a minister or an office holder, but did I want to represent a constituency and speak up for people and indeed hear the sound of my own voice? I did.
Now, you started out on the far right of the Conservative Party. There was reportedly Hang Nelson Mandela T-shirts and the repatriation committee of the Monday Club and Norman Tebbit closing down the Federation of Conservative Students because it was so right-wing, even for his taste. How much of that is true, and where did those beliefs come from?
I was a member of the Immigration, Repatriation and Race Relations Industry Subcommittee of the Monday Club. And as I've said on a number of occasions, that is the most shameful feature of my political record. I'm very embarrassed about that. I'm very apologetic for it. And I feel contrite. I didn't think of myself as a racist, but I was sidling up to people who certainly were racist. And I feel very guilty about that. I'm afraid I must take responsibility for it, but if you say, well, where did it come from? Was there someone else involved? The answer is that I did inhale from my late father. And although my late father was himself Jewish and was brought up in Dalston in Hackney in the 1930s and knew about the Cable Street riots and the threat of the black shirts and so on, he himself was very hostile to new Commonwealth and Pakistani immigration, and I think I was influenced by him, but I was wrong. I never wore a Hang Nelson Mandela t-shirt, but several members of the Federation of Conservative Students did. I was chairman at the time that the FCS was formally closed down, but the record will show that Norman Tebbit closed down the Federation in spite and not because of me. And he appointed me to run the successor body. So that's the full unvarnished truth. I have a checkered history. I made bad judgments and mistakes, but sometimes, either through malice or ignorance, people lump it all together and say, well, all of that was Bercow's record. You have only to ask Norman, and Norman will tell you, I didn't close the Federation down because of John. At the time, I thought John was the sanest person in the street.
Now, when you got elected to Parliament in 1997, you were the darling of the right wing of the Conservative Party, and yet you ended up by supporting the Labour Party. Most people get more right wing as they get older. How come you've become more left wing as you've got older?
I accept it's odd. I don't know whether that thesis about people becoming more conservative as they get older, which I've always believed, is empirically supported, but certainly anecdotally, that's been my experience. A lot of people start on the left and move rightwards, and I have done the opposite. How so? A lot of Conservatives were influenced by the 1997 election, when we were virtually wiped out. Funnily enough, I wasn't. I remained rabidly right-wing for a number of years after that. Philip, Esther, the election that really influenced me, that, if you like, knocked me for six, was the 2001 election, because I had railed and inveighed against the Blair government. I didn't at the time have a high opinion of Tony Blair or of New Labour, and I represented a very conservative constituency, and I thought, well, presumably they will be reined back, the majority will be slashed, or better still, will get into office. In 2001, after 4 years of that government, we lost again, not by 178, but by 167, a majority of 167. And the Conservative seat tally went up from 165 to 166. That was the product of 4 years of the leadership of Mr. William Hague. And I thought, well, I didn't think much of that first 4 years of New Labour, but look where we are. We're hardly in any better position. So I thought to myself, what's at the root of this? And my judgment was that people disapproved of us on so many fronts. They thought we knew the price of everything and the value of nothing, that we hadn't atoned for our attitude to and weakening of the public services, and they thought, frankly, we were rather unpleasant. The so-called nasty party image seemed to me to contain more than a grain of truth. In fact, I think at one point I said we were widely regarded as racist, sexist, homophobic and anti-youth. That didn't make me think, well, I don't want to be a member of the Conservative Party, but it did make me think the Conservative Party is going to have to shift substantially, both as a matter of principle and as a matter of political pragmatism. Now, you may think I was wrong or you may think I was right, but that was why and how I came to shift from the hard right towards the political centre.
John Bercow there, former Speaker of the House of Commons. And as we said, we will be discussing that interview with John Bercow with the broadcaster and journalist and author Michael Crick. Now, I have to say, without doubt, Michael, you are a formidable interviewer and you also have an encyclopedic sort of memory there on news and politics. I know you know Bercow, but what I want to say is What did you think? Do you think he's coming across as honest? Do you think he's reflective there? What did you think so far?
I thought he was very honest and funny. You know, I mean, describing himself as rabidly right-wing and so on. But actually, you know, I played a small role in John Bercow's election back in 2009. And
so you're to blame.
I sometimes think I am. And what happened was, I was in Portcullis House, in the House of Parliament, and Bercow had announced he was standing. It was the early stages of the election for Speaker. And I see him coming towards me. I said, John, you know, come have a cup of tea, you know. And we sat down. I said, look, John, I was looking at the betting lists and your name's not in there. And I said, if I were you, I say it sort of tongue-in-cheek, I said, if I were you, I'd get a wealthy friend of yours to nip round to the bookmaker and put a big bet on you. Anyway, later on that day, I look at the betting list and suddenly Bercow's name's appeared. And I thought, oh, well, you know, maybe he did, you know, and I just laughed to myself and left it at that. Years later, a man called Sebastian Whale, 10 years later, rang me up and said, I'm writing a book about Bercow. Tell us what happened in the Portcullis House. So I did. And he said, yeah, well, what happened was, after that, Bercow went out and found a fellow Lambeth councillor from at the time he's at Lambeth Council and got him to go round all the bookmakers putting on 50 quid here, 30 quid here, 20 quid here, and that shifted the odds. Now, whether that's legal or proper, Philip, you'll be able to tell me because you're from that industry.
Well, it's both legal and proper, but in fact, Chris Huhne did it, I think, when he stood against Vince Cable for the leadership of the Lib Dems. I believe that lots of his supporters were placing bets in order to build momentum for his campaign as the odds came down. So I think...
And it often happens in by-elections as well. Well, anyway, there's another sequel to this, because I was at a party this summer and I met Gillian Keegan, the government minister, who I know and get on with. And she said, oh, have you met my husband, Michael? And I'm introduced. And Michael says, yeah, you and I have had a bit of an involvement in an episode. I was the man who went round putting the...
I hope he bought you a drink on the back of it.
That's right, because he and Bercow apparently went and celebrated Bercow's victory back in 2009 with a big lavish dinner at the Oxo Tower. And they didn't invite me.
But when he talked about checkered history, he's got things wrong, he's got things right. I mean, that was just the opening part of our interview. We'll go to another bit shortly. Did you think, OK, I'm listening to what he says, and he is coming across as really having thought about what he did during his time in Parliament?
I did, and what I'm curious about is whether he's going to be equally honest about all the controversies of his speakership. And one interesting point, of course, is the shift, as you pointed out. Normally the shift is from left to right, and it's a rare example of going the other way around. The other big example, I think, is Tony Benn, who, remember, started out on the right of the Labour Party and became very much on the left. But Tony Benn's journey is tiny compared with John Bercow's. And all the way from the right of the Conservative Party. Well, it's difficult to say where he is in the sort of middle of the Labour Party.
What do you put it down to, that political journey?
Well, I'm still not clear from what he said what it is to do with. I mean, it's odd, given his Jewish background, that he should have been involved with, you know, some pretty unsavoury people in the Federation of Conservative Students. And
he sort of blames that on his dad, doesn't he? Sort of blames that on his dad.
I mean, but this argument that it was all to do with the failings of the William Hague years, well, other people were unhappy then, but it didn't mean they all joined the Labour Party. They just thought, you know, Cameron would be another example. They just decided to be Conservatives in a different way. And for him to go all that journey, I think one of the problems was he made himself more and more unpopular amongst Conservatives, and in a way, that, I think, drove him out as well, probably. And also his wife, of course.
Yes.
And people are inevitably influenced by their spouses, apart from you.
Nothing wrong with that, Mike.
There's nothing wrong with it at all. No.
We will certainly come on to that. Thank you for now, Michael. Let's now watch part 2 of our exclusive interview with former Speaker John Bercow, in which we continue our conversation about his move from the political right to the political left.
A lot of people will think there were two main reasons, and one would say, was it your wife, Sally, who you're devoted to, married in 2002, and she was somebody who influenced you and changed your opinion. A lot of people would say that about wives of their husbands, full stop. But was Sally an influence on you?
Sally must have been an influence on me, because I think partners do influence each other. And I think if you're spending a huge amount of time with someone that you care about and you talk about those matters because they're front and centre stage to your interests, it's bound to have an impact. So did she have some impact on me? For example, in saying to me, you know, it's not the most pernicious thing if there's a national minimum wage, honey. It's not going to ruin the economy. It's not going to cause us to flatline. It's not going to make us the subject of mass unemployment. Of course it had an impact. I don't accept the, if I may say so, somewhat sexist view that there was this manipulative woman in the background trying to choreograph events and in some sinister fashion trying to contrive the destruction of the Conservative Party or, you know, the evisceration of all conservative beliefs. I don't accept that. But yes, she did have an impact on me. But I would say on the whole, it was the observation of our continued political failure that caused me to think, how can the Conservative Party adjust its position in a way it's been very flexible at doing over centuries so that it becomes a player again, just as it did, for example, in the aftermath of the Second World War. The Conservative Party wasn't originally in favour of the creation of the National Health Service or the development of an extensive welfare state, but it compromised with those positions because, frankly, they were very popular and they came to be regarded as broadly, or in some cases very, successful. The Conservative Party has never elevated ideology, perhaps until now, over common sense and the political survival instinct. So did she have an impact? She did. Was it the major factor in triggering a move leftwards? It wasn't.
The other thing...
But if there are people who determinedly believe that, as part of a sort of general critique of me, I can't help them. They're beyond treatment. There's no cure for them.
You know what Parliament's like. We all have sort of ideas of what's gone on. We all like conspiracy theories.
Indeed.
You can all start a rumour in a room probably with only one other person. And the other thing, people might have said, oh, it was a tactical decision on your behalf. There you are. You wanted to become Speaker. It would have been a Blair government. It would have been the majority of Labour people in the House. You would have needed their vote. Was it a tactical decision to go to the left so that you could win the vote of Speaker?
No. The trouble with that argument, which has been, I hesitate to say popularised, but advanced by at least one rather down-market journalist who isn't worth mentioning by name, is that the timings don't work. The truth of the matter is that I started moving left from the 2001 election onwards, so much so that by the time that Philip arrived in the House as the member for Shipley in 2005, I think he probably thought that I was certainly eligible to submit an application to join the Communist Party of Great Britain. I wasn't, but I had already been moving leftwards for 4 years. I made a decision finally to focus on backbench activity and the eventual pursuit of the speakership in 2004-05. Conceptually in 2004, and then in 2005 I applied to join the Speaker's panel of chairs, and I did join that in, I think, June 2005. And from then on, I was completely focused on that. Esther, Philip, it is true that I thought to myself, if I don't want to be a minister, if I don't want to be having sort of rebarbative arguments across the front bench, across the dispatch box with political opponents, but have decided that I would like a role, which is the choice of the House as a whole, it would make sense to try to win friends rather than arguments. So it is true that I said to myself, things that I used to do, I'd better stop doing. I used to shout out a lot and heckle very noisily, sometimes very critically of other people. And I stopped doing that.
Often me, I think.
Possibly even Philip himself. And I stopped doing that because I thought, well, look, if I'm serious about becoming Speaker, A, it's a good idea to try to win friends and influence people rather than make as many enemies as possible in the course of a day. And B, without being overly pompous about it, if you want to be Speaker, you don't really want to be heckler-in-chief. In fact, that's a journey, very belatedly, and sadly from his point of view, not successfully, that Chris Bryant undertook. Chris Bryant used to be a very, very, very regular heckler, constantly calling out people's errors, rebuking them, telling them when they were wrong or historically ill-informed or whatever. And then when he decided he wanted to become Speaker, he adjusted his approach. And in fact, I don't mind admitting that I suggested to him that he should adjust his approach. So I did. And when people said to me, oh, John, you know, I really approve of your view on this, did I say to them, oh, you shouldn't? And if I approved of somebody's view, did I feel inclined to say so to people on the left who I agreed with about the fight against global poverty or LGBT equality? I did. And did that probably help to win me friends? Yes, but I mean, if I had taken advice from the Conservative Whip's office as to how to go about winning the speakership, their advice would have been calculated on the basis of let's tell John to do everything that will ensure he loses. Whereas actually I was quite interested in winning.
Well,
so if I'm supposed to apologise for that, dream on.
So it was very tactical then. You did have to get the votes of the House. You did so, and you went on a journey.
What's not true is that I moved leftwards to win Labour votes. That's not true at all.
Back here now with Michael Crick. Interesting there. I thought he's far more competitive than you would possibly think. And he really had planned where he was going. It was not a fluke. He really had planned. What did you take from that section of the interview?
Well, I was surprised that he had the speakership in mind as early as 20... I mean, that's 5 years before the election came up. And, of course, in the meantime, he was never a deputy speaker, which is very unusual for a speaker. But I seem to remember he had a big falling out with Michael Howard, didn't he? And he, his front bench career, he was in the shadow cabinet for a while, and his front bench career came to an end. So that was a factor too. The endorsement for Chris Bryant. Chris Bryant won't be too pleased to have John Bercow's backing, or at least to be known that he's been advising Chris Bryant when the next speakership comes up. So it was interesting. And of course, what then happened in 2009 is that Labour MPs thought, hey, we can make a bit of mischief here. Because, of course, it was really meant to be the Conservatives' turn. You're meant to have one, then the other. And so it was a way of getting Bercow in, with Labour votes, and saying, well, you've got to speak. He's a Conservative, you've had this is your turn. When, of course, the number of Conservative votes he got when he was elected in 2009 was about 15 or something. It was very few.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting because you had to have, for the rules, you had to have a minimum number of backers from another party.
Yes.
No one had actually ever thought that you might need that rule from your own party. And actually, funnily enough, I don't know, maybe we should have asked him how many supporters he had but I don't think he had that many. And if there had been a minimum criteria from your own party as well, he could well have struggled. But what I wanted to ask you, Michael, with your sort of historical perspective about politics, is that 5-year sort of thinking about becoming the Speaker and doing things to might help. Would that be typical of people who become Speaker? Is that just what you have to do to become Speaker? Or would that be unusual?
A lot of people do, plan to be Speaker. And it's a very difficult thing to plan to be because the election often throws up as somebody who's not expected. But, I've known people who've been thinking or have thought about it in the past for a long time and, gone around trying to be nice and trying not to offend anybody and trying to look serious, a serious chairman-like person rather than a professional heckler like you and Bercow in your early years. But normally people want to be ministers, don't they? And from time to time, ex-ministers then get the job. It's they move from one to the other. But I think in Bercow's case, his ministerial career was going, he wasn't going to go very far under Cameron either.
Unusual for an MP to realise their ministerial career is over. So he is deeply honest, wasn't he? Yeah. So he knows he's not going to get that. And that's why I said very competitive, because he knows he wants a place in history. He knows he wants a place in Parliament.
And also extraordinary for somebody so young. Yes. What is he now? He's 59. So when we're talking about 20... this is nearly 20 years ago he made this decision. So he must have been only 41 when he decides he's going to be the Speaker. Normally, being the Speaker is something you think about in your 60s, really, or 70s, and that's when you get it. And he became Speaker incredibly young, didn't he? 2009, I'm just trying to do the maths. Bercow would do it like that. He became Speaker at 46-ish. Yeah.
Just very quickly before we move on, the other thing that came up in the interview was the influence of Sally on his decision. Yes. What do you make of the influence of Sally on his political journey?
Well, I think she clearly was important. I think he's absolutely right that it's inevitable in marriages or relationships, you do influence each other. And I think there's a lot of rubbish written about this. And in fact, and contradictory rubbish. Everybody said it was outrageous and sexist to suggest that Philip May might have been an influence on Theresa. And knowing both of them, I'm sure he was. And then they say it's also sexist to suggest that Carrie Johnson might have been an influence on Boris Johnson. Well, surely they can't both be sexist propositions. And surely it's inevitable. You come home late at night, oh, God, blimey, what are we going to do about this? And inevitably, your spouse is going to say, well, I think you're, making a mistake here, or why don't you do this, why don't you do that? And, I mean, maybe there are some who chat about spouses who chat about politics more than others. But I think
I know the feeling of that one, Michael. Now, look, we're going to have to take a break, but we will come back, obviously, to Michael here and also that exclusive interview with the former Commons Speaker, John Bercow. So don't go anywhere.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens,
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back to the show. Let's now go back to our exclusive interview with John Bercow.
Lots of people won't know the importance of the role of Speaker. So what is it and what appealed to you?
The Speaker should be an umpire. The Speaker is not supposed to play for one side or the other, but to know everybody, treat one individual fairly by comparison with another, have a regard to the rights of minority parties as well as to those of the governing party. The Speaker should be always on the side of Parliament if there is a clash with the executive branch. I think the Speaker should always err on the side of wanting to give the House its say and potentially its way. And the Speaker's got to be good on his or her feet, dexterous enough to cope with the unexpected. I mean, I think, for example, if you haven't got a very good memory and you don't remember people's names, that's a bit of a disqualification for serving as Speaker.
The Speaker before you.
Well, Michael didn't find that part of the job that easy. I think he was rather a decent and kind man, and I think he was subject to a great deal of snobbery, prejudice, sectarian, anti-Scottish, anti-Catholic feeling, and so on. I do, but I note the point you make. I like to think that when I looked at the skill set, competent on the feet, fair-minded, interested in maximising debate, willing to speak truth to power, in other words, in dealings with the government, I could tick those boxes. I thought I'd got those qualities. Why did I want to be Speaker if I'm scrupulously and unsparingly honest with you? At first, for a very short period, I thought I enjoy backbench life. I don't want to be a minister. I'm not going to be asked to be a minister. I wouldn't be a very good minister, but I think I can do something more than serve as a backbencher. And I did quite fancy the idea of serving as Speaker with the accompanying status. But that didn't last very long because it's not my natural instinct to be someone and not have a mission. And so very quickly after deciding, oh, I'd rather like to be Speaker, I thought, well, what would I do if I got the job? And that's when in that period, and I had 4 to 5 years to think about it, I started to think, well, this would be my plan. I would like to empower backbenchers. I would like to ensure there's greater topicality and urgency in debate. I'd like to make reforms across the parliamentary estate to make the place more child-friendly and inclusive. And I would like the idea as Speaker, as I did, I know, in Philip's constituency and elsewhere, of getting out and about, visiting schools, visiting universities, visiting voluntary organisations, visiting faith groups, visiting public bodies, talking to, being questioned by, hearing from, engaging with members of civil society. So for quite a long time, that was my intended platform, and that was the platform on which I stood. And it was the platform which I then sought to deliver. And I think some people who didn't approve of that approach have never forgiven me for sticking to my mission. I remember Peter Hain once saying to me, John, I, as Leader of the House, served with a number of speakers. I've witnessed a number of speakers. He said, I've never known in my time in the House a speaker who was not captured to some degree by the establishment. You were never captured. You always behaved as a rather anti-establishment figure.
I agree.
And, you know, whether I was good or not is not for me to say. That is for other people to judge. But did I just want to be there? No, I wanted to be able at the end of my time to say that I did things, that I made a difference, that I brought about change. And a lot of that change I had a lot of support for from people on both sides of the House and indeed from staff. But there was a sprinkling of people who were furiously resistant to a lot of what I wanted to do. And I felt to contend with that and to try nevertheless to navigate a way through to deliver the sorts of changes I wanted to make, including, for example, on granting urgent questions. I got regular advice from clerks against urgent questions. There was usually an attitude of, well, why not think about it again tomorrow, Mr. Speaker? Well, the member could seek an adjournment debate next week. And I would say, well, no, the matter ought to be interrogated today.
I don't hold it against you, John, but I think I had many urgent questions.
Now, when you stood for Speaker, I remember, I don't know if you recall, but we had a conversation. It lasted about 45 minutes in Portcullis House, when actually, rather rudely probably, I gave you all the reasons why I wasn't going to vote for you to be Speaker.
And I've never held it against you, Philip, as you know.
And
I rather respected it.
The three reasons I gave at the time, I distinctly remember. One is that I said I thought you were far too opinionated and were too intolerant of other people's opinions to be Speaker. The second was I thought you'd be too politically correct. And the third reason was I thought you were too young and that you would, in effect, your career would sort of peak and end too soon. What did you make of those criticisms at the time, and what do you make of them now, looking back?
Well, I could understand why you thought as you did, because after all, we'd been on the same side of the House. We'd always got on quite well personally, in some cases very well, but we had now and again clashed in or in the margins of debates. And you probably thought, well, just as I hold my views very strongly, John holds his very strongly, and he just won't be able to resist almost an inadvertent bias and intolerance of other views. I remember saying to you, yes, but the clue's in the title. Speaker of the House, the impartial upholder of the rights of backbenchers. I intend to be the umpire, not an evaluator. But of course, it's one thing to say what you would do, and it's another to prove to someone who's sceptical. And you didn't believe me. And I suppose the only thing I would say in response, Philip, is that a couple of years later, as I think you'll also recall, you came up to me during or at the end of a reception in Speaker's House and said, could you have a word? And I said, absolutely. And you said, you'll recall that conversation we had when I told you that I thought you weren't the right person to be Speaker because you would be too opinionated and you'd be intolerant of other views and you'd close people like me down. Well, I was wrong. You've proved yourself to be fair-minded. So looking back, I feel that I was vindicated, but I could quite understand why you thought that. On the point about being too young, well, it seemed to me that I could look after my own interests in that regard. So in other words, when a member sort of said, oh, but that would mean you finishing very young, I thought, well, so what? That's my choice. Now, I regarded you as very fair-minded. I can think of another colleague, an older colleague, who said to me he would very much advise me against standing for Speaker. And he didn't make those other arguments you made, but he said, what are you? 45, 46? And I said, yes, I'm 46. And he said, so what, you'd do the job for 8 or 9 years? And I said, yes, about that. He said, so you'd finish at 55? And I said, yes. He said, well, how are you going to make a living after that? And I said to him, well, Richard, I said, I think I'll manage to keep body and soul together. And he said, well, I think very unwise, very unwise. And a few days later, he turned up as the campaign manager for another candidate. So, you know, I knew what his game was. He was just trying to discourage me from standing. I don't think the point about age really was compelling, because if you looked historically, as I think I said on June the 22nd, 2009, when I stood for election, Speaker Grenville was elected at 29 and Speaker Addington at 32. Indeed.
So relatively old then.
Yeah, indeed, both of them went on to become Prime Minister in a different era. And I said, no, look, I don't think that's a problem. I felt that, as you say, by historical standards, I was quite old to be Speaker. So looking back, I feel you were wrong, but I don't think it was surprising that you held the views you did. And although I hoped you'd support me, did I really think you would after some of our slightly waspish exchanges on political matters? No.
I think you once called me a troglodyte, I think, in a debate.
I think I did call you a troglodyte, yeah. But look, you know, the thing is, you took the time and trouble, Philip, to take me aside. I think we sat and had a cup of coffee together, and you were willing to talk it through, and it was done, as always in your case, it was one of your great qualities, not one of mine, without a shred of unkindness, still less malice. I mean, I'll give you an example. No doubt we'll come on to all my failures of where I think you're particularly good and I'm less so. You've always been very good at playing the ball rather than the man or woman. And don't forget, I've spent long periods of time, very enjoyable periods of time in the chair listening to speeches by you, particularly on private members' bill days on Fridays, but not only on those days. And, you know, you would rip an argument apart of an opponent, including people on your own side of the House, but it was never done with personal hostility or venom or malice. It was always done with good humour and sometimes in quite a matter-of-fact way. And you would sometimes tease a colleague. I remember one colleague who is, I think, now a member of the government, and he said, well, I can see, Mr. Speaker, how my honourable friend will make a very good minister in the future. She is singing from the government's hymn sheet to perfection. And I applaud that, and she's entitled to her view, but I just happen to think she's wrong. And it was done very gently. And I think she knew, probably, if she was bright, and I think she was quite bright, that you were taking her apart. My weakness has sometimes been to be too personal and to end up offending people, and I made mistakes in that regard, mistakes that you haven't made.
So, welcome back. Michael's still with us.
We're going to do some of the views from the viewers.
OK, let's have some...
Because you've been getting in touch and we want to hear more of your views. Don't forget where you send it to, gbviews@gbnews.uk. I've got John here. I have no time for someone who used his power to attempt to deny the will of a majority in the referendum who voted to leave the EU. We're going to come on to that bit of the interview a little bit later on.
Kenny says, the reason Bercow joined the Labour Party was, I believe, because he thinks it's a way into the House of Lords, nothing more or less. He betrayed the Brexit referendum vote by continually blocking it and being partial to the Remain camp in the Commons.
Dennis can't fathom his thinking. Bercow is blinded by his own ambition.
And Ryan says anyone who goes through his own motions to further his own means should be expelled from the country immediately. Gosh, that's harsh, Ryan.
And Catherine says, I always found him to be a poor politician, but a good speaker. And then, in brackets, shame about his beliefs.
And Gareth says, this man should never be allowed near politics again. I don't know if that means me or John Bercow, Gareth.
Maybe, two in one shot.
Maybe both. Maybe both is what you're killing us both off in one
But
he did
say, John did say he wanted this platform, and he explained for why. But he also talked about the modernisation. So he talked about making it more topical, empowering backbenchers, modernisation. Do you think he did that?
I do think he did that. And, of course, you've got to remember, he became Speaker right in the middle of, you know, the biggest crisis that Parliament's probably ever had in terms of members of Parliament, the expenses crisis of 2009. And that's why, of course, Michael Martin had to go. And and there was
Michael Martin being the
previous speaker. And there was this clamour for, we've got to restore respect for Parliament. and we've got to restore, the power of backbenchers. And he pretty quickly did that, and I think that is a very big plus point. These things called urgent questions. We had one this week where the opposition is allowed to put down an urgent question. In this case, it was about why Kwasi Kwarteng was sacked. You used to get 2 of those a year, apparently, and under Bercow, there was 1 a week, and you had to answer quite a few of them, I believe.
I think it went to a stage of being daily.
I think it is. It's absolutely right. You get, in the old days, you would have Parliament having all its debates and questions and so on. And there was no topicality about it. And the country and the media would be discussing one set of issues, and Parliament would be discussing another. And never the twain shall meet. And it looked very dated. And Bercow was determined to make it more topical, which he did. He was determined to allow MPs to question the executive, ministers, a lot more. It meant that Prime Minister's questions, sometimes went on for an hour rather than half an hour. It meant that Prime Ministers like Theresa May had to answer questions when there was a big statement when they'd come back from abroad, for 2.5 hours, if I remember rightly. Whereas in the old days, it would be limited to an hour. And the ministers and the executive, and of course they were all Conservative, nearly all of Bercow's time, a few Lib Dems and a few Labour in the first year, they didn't like this because they had to do a lot more work. They were put on the spot. And add to that the feeling that Bercow was a bit of a traitor amongst your Conservative ranks, and that, he had a really hard time. But I think the really positive thing is he was a great reforming speaker, unlike any we've had in modern times.
I think as a backbencher at the time who was there when Michael Martin was Speaker and then when John Bercow took over, I have to say that when Michael Martin was Speaker, not only, as Esther alluded to earlier, did he not know who anybody was, which was a bit of a disadvantage for the Speaker, but we hardly, if you were on the back, you hardly ever got to ask a question. I mean, there'd be 20-odd questions down on the order paper. We'd never get beyond number 6, ever. Prime Minister's questions, there'd be 15 people listed. We'd never get below number 10, ever. If you had 12 or 13, you knew you weren't going to get called. Yeah. Whereas John Bercow insisted on getting through the whole order paper. However long it took, if you're on the order paper, he wanted you to have an opportunity to answer.
It did get boring at times, because you then get 10 people in a row all asking the same question and getting the same answer.
But if you're on the back benches, it was great, because you knew you were going to be able... You would turn up to the chamber knowing that you would be able to ask your question, whereas before people had given up, thinking they're never going to get to me.
This is just what Parliament needed, when it had to go through this appalling scandal where all sorts of MPs had been exposed as claiming absurd expense claims, and many of them had to stand down and resign. And Parliament needed that, that impetus again, and that reform movement. And Bercow was not the only player in that, other important, but he did play a huge role in that. And because the other interesting thing I thought from the interview was him saying, well, it's my job to stand up for MPs and Parliament against the executive. And of course, where it all came a cropper later on was when you had a third player in that, and that was the people, in the form of the 2016 referendum. Where do they stand within that equation? And no doubt we'll get on to that.
We certainly will.
So let's now return to our exclusive interview with John Bercow, in which we speak about criticisms made against him.
There are some criticisms, as you alluded to, as Speaker, which we sort of want to take in,
of course,
in turn. The first is, you mentioned about wanting to be a referee rather than a participant. I think one of the criticisms is that, a good referee on a football pitch, you don't notice that they're there, they're just letting the game go on. And I guess one of the criticisms is that you like the sound of your own whistle a bit too much, so to speak, in refereeing terms, and being the centre of attention. And what do you make of that criticism?
Do I like the sound of my own whistle too much? Yes. Did I speak too much? Yes. Should I have been more succinct? Yes. That criticism is a fair criticism. I've always been loquacious. I've always been on the prolix side. I inherited that from my father, who spoke in paragraphs. And my mother used to say to him, "Oh, Charles, you'll never use one word where 100 will do." And they used to have these little debates when she would say, "Oh, Charles, the point could be made more succinctly. You insist on developing it at great length." And he used to say, "Well, Brenda, you don't finish the point. You're so keen to rush on to something else that you don't actually finish the sentence, or you don't develop the argument fully, so to speak." So you know, they were polar opposites in that sense. He was rather long-winded and she very often didn't tell the full story. Now, I, as you can tell, inherit far more of my father's traits in that respect than my mother's traits, and I've always been loquacious. So did I sometimes speak too much? I did. The only two caveats I'd insert, and it is a failing of mine, I don't think it meant that I was a bad speaker, and I think during a very high-octane time, the idea that the speaker wouldn't have to intervene quite a lot was not realistic. It was so humongously noisy, I had to do so. The only two caveats I would utter are these. First, I think some of the people, and I don't include you or Esther in this category, who say that are people who basically just didn't like me, and, you know, it was added to the charge sheet, oh, you know, he's this, he's that, and he talks too much and so on, and they were just people who were hostile. And so it was just on the list of objections. And the other caveat is that even now, I mean, I meet people every single day going around London who come up to me completely self-selecting. I'm not saying it's representative of the country, self-selecting, because if people don't know you, they're not going to come up to you, or if people think you're a 24-carat tosser, they're probably not going to bother to come up and say so and pick an argument. They'll just go about their business and think, oh God, there's that bloke Bercow, we didn't like him, pleased he's gone. But every day people come up to me and say, oh, we miss you in the chair, I respect what you did, I so enjoyed it. Only on Monday, when I was taking my daughter to a medical appointment, I was on a train and a woman came up to me and she said, I really miss you in the chair, Mr. Bercow, and I loved your use of the English language. And that does happen a lot. So yes, I was long-winded and I shouldn't have been, and it probably got on people's nerves, and I should have intervened less and been more self-disciplined. I was worse when I was tired, because when I was really tired, you know, I'd be more indisciplined. So that is a fair criticism, but I don't think it is, if I may say so, a slam dunk.
Would you say that you play to the gallery a bit too much? So let me give you an example. When it was mooted that President Trump might want to come and give an address to Parliament, you were asked about this when you were in the chair. It struck me that the Speaker might say, well, look, no formal request has been made. If a formal request is made, it'll be considered in the normal way. And that's what I would have expected a Speaker to say. But you didn't. You said that under no circumstances is this man going to be addressing Parliament without any reference to the Lord Speaker, which I think caused some irritation there as well. Would you consider that to be a failing, the sort of playing to the gallery accusation?
I think I sometimes did play to the gallery. I think I was sometimes guilty of being, if you like, almost entrapped in or consumed by the moment and probably revelling in the theatre of it. I don't myself think that that is a compelling example. I completely understand that point of view. That point of view was expressed to me by a number of people. You're not alone, including other friends of mine. I know Julian Lewis thought that I was wrong about that. I remember John Redwood came to see me and he said, John, I think you mishandled that. My attitude, Philip, at the time was that I knew from correspondence behind the scenes that the government was very seriously entertaining the idea. The government wanted to invite President Trump to address Parliament. Julian at one point sort of saying to me, it wasn't going to happen, was just quite wrong. I said, well, sorry, Julian, but I know what was going on behind the scenes, and it was going to happen. And the fact is, I was irritated, maybe more irritated than I should have been, but I was irritated by reading what were obviously briefed articles in the newspapers at the time. Don't ask me now to quote every example because I couldn't, but there were articles in the newspapers at the time suggesting that the government was proceeding apace and planning to make that happen. And therefore, to be honest, I wanted to nip it in the bud. My sense was, rightly or wrongly, that most colleagues would prefer him not to come, and I thought there were compelling reasons why he shouldn't. The Lord Speaker at the time was sitting gloriously on the fence, in some danger of puncturing himself in a sensitive place, and I thought it better to have an opinion and express it. But did it drive people crackers on the Conservative benches? It did. If you're asking me, do I regret it? I don't, but I do think it was a mistake on my part. It wasn't malicious, it wasn't intended to be troublemaking, it was a surplus of candour. It was a mistake on my part to say to somebody at Reading, I think it was, in answer to questions after a lecture, that I had voted to remain in the referendum. I think it would have been better if I hadn't said that. Now, quite a lot of people probably thought, well, John voted remain, but I didn't need to say that, and it would have been wiser not to do so. So I'm trying to be completely candid with you. I did make mistakes. I don't personally regret what I said about Trump. I think it would have been better if I hadn't said what I did about voting Remain, especially in view of the way matters subsequently developed.
Which we'll come on to.
I'm sure.
So, Michael Crick, what did you make of his response to those failings that were put to him?
I don't think I've ever heard so many confessions from a politician. I mean, I expect if you'd said, what about these 3 murders and 17 burglaries, he would have said yes as well. I mean, it was just extraordinary. He owned up to virtually everything you put to him, and which actually is a very unusual quality in politics, and makes him very very light. You think, gosh. Maybe he's a much nicer person than I thought. The Trump thing, I think, was a big error because it gave away his politics. There are a significant number of, I don't know how many, but there were a significant number of MPs, all Conservatives, I think, who were Trump supporters. And of course, then the confession, as he says, about having voted Remain was another error. And, he looked more and more partisan as the speakership went on, and that was the problem. But I just can't believe how many confessions you've got out of him, you two.
He was going to the priest, he was going to churches. The other thing he said there about briefings to the papers, and it did really bristle him, and that's true of any speakers, because really it shouldn't be going to the papers, it actually should be done in the floor of the House, as you well know. Do you think that got his back up, and that's what he was reacting to sometimes?
Yeah, of course. But, that's politics. Everybody gets briefed against to the papers or to the broadcasters, and you have to learn to cope with it.
You take these briefings, do you? Because you make a living out of these briefings.
I'm not always their first choice.
But that relationship is a delicate one between media, politicians, isn't it, and the Speaker, and what he'd expect as the etiquette on the floor of the House.
Yeah. I mean, also as a Speaker, he would talk to journalists quite a lot as well. And he didn't get that with previous speakers, so far as I'm aware. Certainly I didn't. But, you saw him wandering around, and a lot more, I think, than other speakers, and you'd stop and chat, and, that was another aspect to his speakership. He was much more open, and, of course, he did all of that going around the country, talking to schools and universities, too. And it wasn't just talking about Parliament, but democracy.
Michael, thank you very much. Now let's get back to our interview with John Bercow, and we asked him, obviously, about the accusations of bullying.
And then another criticism would have been about bullying,
yeah.
Something that I think you feel sort of personally aggrieved about there. But do you, looking back, think, did I treat my House of Commons staff well? Or do you think there were times, because you have a great command of the English language, where you overly harsh with members of Parliament in the House when you would take them to task or rebuke them? Do you ever look back at that and say there was cause for people to think there was bullying there?
I certainly don't think there was cause for people to think there was bullying. Let me separate those two issues, Esther, because they're important, but they need to be treated as distinct entities on their own. As far as the handling of colleagues is concerned, I think most of the time it was fine. People were pretty good-natured. But I would, on reflection, say that I sometimes mishandled individual situations. On one occasion, for example, I was rude to Greg Hands quite late at night. I think I had probably almost masochistically, but I enjoyed it, stayed in the chair for hours and hours and hours and hours in those Brexit debates. And he heckled something, and I was irritated, and I rounded on him and was rude to him, and I shouldn't have been, and I apologised to him in the chamber the following day. And I think there were other occasions when I was unduly irascible and waspish. I can think of one example of a new member who outraged me by asking a question, and while the exchanges on that question were ongoing, that as soon as he'd finished, he beetled out of the chamber. And I thought, this is an extraordinary way to behave, and it's in total contravention of the conventions of the House. Now, Esther, in retrospect, what should I have done? I tried to get him to come back in the chamber, and he did, but I should just have asked him to come up to the chair, and I should gently, or not gently, as the case may be, but I should have said to him, don't do that. It is a considerable parliamentary discourtesy. He was a new member. I didn't. He came back in the chamber and I said, well, very good, or words to that effect, of the honourable gentleman to return to the chamber. Well, I'm glad he has, but it was quite extraordinary for the honourable gentleman to ask a question, then immediately beetle out. In total violation of the conventions of this House. I can't understand what motivated him. So, in other words, I sort of tore him off a strip in a way that wasn't wise or necessary. Now, I'm told by a friend of mine, who is a mutual friend of this chap and of mine, that he doesn't bear a grudge. But at the time, he was probably quite irritated. I remember Charles Walker once telling me Sajid Javid was upset when I laid into him one day about the handling of a government statement. I thought he'd mishandled the whole thing. The House hadn't been given the documentation in advance. The House was treated with considerable discourtesy, but I literally trod on him and said, well, extraordinary behaviour by the Secretary of State. It's quite unacceptable to me and to the House. And he apparently went off feeling, this high and feeling somewhat aggrieved. So I think I sometimes did mishandle those situations, but I think I could point to a very large number that I handled with humour. I think a lot of people would say that members of Parliament ought to be, frankly, a bit robust. And quite a lot of colleagues are very good at dishing it out, but they don't like taking it. I would also point out that I never threw a Conservative member out of the chamber. I threw out 3 opposition members over 10 years, in every case for accusations against other members of dishonesty, i.e. they impugned the integrity of another member. And so I asked Nigel Dodds, Paul Flynn and Dennis Skinner on separate occasions to leave the chamber. I never asked a Conservative member to leave the chamber. So, yes, I sometimes got it wrong, but, was there bullying there? I don't think there was bullying there at all. As far as staff is concerned, all I can say, as far as staff are concerned, all I would say is I got on incredibly well with the vast majority of people with whom I worked. Very large numbers of people I worked with over a very long period who stayed with me for a long time. There were people in the Speaker's office who were with me on day 1 and on my final day. People who worked for me, if not for the whole 10 years, for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, etc. There were 3 people who, well, actually 4 people who brought complaints against me. One of them was investigated and thrown out. The others were upheld. Esther, I was accused of ghosting someone on an aeroplane from London to Nairobi in September 2010. The person concerned was sitting some rows behind me. The investigator thought this a most significant matter, that I had blanked this person for several hours. As I patiently and politely explained, it was a night flight. I was en route to making a speech at a conference in front of 400 people the following morning. And, hey presto, surprise, surprise, I went to sleep. I don't call that bullying. I was accused and found guilty of staring in a hostile way at someone on a date the investigator didn't know, but when he told me the subject matter that was being discussed, I was able to tell him the date. And he said that he thought that I'd done that. And I said, well, why didn't you ask the 9 witnesses? Oh, no, I'm not going to ask those witnesses. There were 9 people present at the meeting, I said to him. Oh, no, I'm not going to ask them. And I said, why not? And he said, well, it's so long ago they wouldn't remember. So in other words, and there's a serious point here, on the basis of the say-so of a complainant about something that was 10 years earlier, that wasn't even words spoken, but a facial expression, I was found guilty of bullying. Esther, Philip, I honestly think that if fair-minded people out there are watching this interview, they would think, what? That's not real. That doesn't sound right. And I don't know myself of any workplace in the country or indeed in the democratic world where such a policy exists. And that policy of looking at things that did or didn't happen, that were or weren't said 8, 10, 12 years ago, has since been scrapped. And in fact, wait for it, it was scrapped immediately after my case was concluded. So now people have to bring complaints within 12 months. I was judged on the basis of people's recollections of what happened 10 and 12 years ago. And it was all done under parliamentary privilege so that I couldn't challenge it in court. I wasn't allowed to see communications between decision makers and staff within the House. I wasn't allowed to see any of that. I wasn't allowed to cross-examine people, etc. So I said that it was a kangaroo court, and I would only qualify that statement by saying to say it was a kangaroo court is intensely insulting to kangaroos.
John Bercow there saying viewers would think, what happened there? If you did think that, don't forget, email us gbviews@gbnews.uk. Lots of you have been getting in touch. Sam says, I miss Bercow as Speaker. He was so brilliant that he could wrangle with cats.
Alan says, every pore in this man's body screams arrogant bully. His bias as Speaker was obvious to all and he should never be given a peerage. On the positive, he is a fine orator, but his Mr. Nasty side is never far away. Clearly a man who wants to be the centre of attention and is in love with himself.
But Gary says, I actually loved him as Speaker and the current one is not a patch on John. The only problem I had with him, no matter what he might say, was his bias. Speaker is supposed to be impartial and in some cases, brackets Brexit, he blatantly was not.
And Dave says, Bercow was definitely biased, especially when Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party and during the Brexit debates, talk about having a high opinion of himself. So some mixed opinions there about John
It certainly
Bercow.
was, and we're going to come back to him about those Brexit decisions, what he did, how he did it in the House. We'll come back to that a little bit later on, but send us your views and we'll see you. Oh, and don't forget, Michael Crick is with us. He'll be analysing the next set of interviews as well, but we'll be back with you after this short break.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back. It's 1 minute past 11. Let's now return to our interview with former Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, where we continue our conversation about bullying accusations and his role on the front line during one of the most turbulent periods in recent British political history.
So now Boris is facing an investigation by the Privileges Committee. Do you have any concern for him and this process that he'll be going through and the whole procedure of it?
I do have a concern about the procedure of it, to be honest, because I'm in favour of fairness. I hold no brief for Boris Johnson, whom I thought was an absolutely appalling Prime Minister. But I think that the question of due process and fairness is incredibly important. If what he said in the House was untrue, that's one thing. If it can be shown that he deliberately told an untruth, that is another thing and a very serious thing, but that is quite a challenge for that to be proved. Do I think that where other matters are concerned, things that weren't even in the chamber, things that he might or might not have said in interviews or in meetings in Downing Street or whatever, should be the subject of cross-examination? I do. I think he should have the right to cross-examine. Should he be able to deploy legal representation? In my opinion, yes. I think that we come back to this question of parliamentary privilege. It's very important that there aren't unfairnesses committed in the name of a parliamentary process. Parliamentary privilege exists to allow members of parliament to champion great causes, to call out wrongdoing when they might not necessarily be able to prove it in a court, but they want to highlight a great cause. I don't think anybody ever seriously thought that a workplace bullying process would be conducted on the principle that it was subject to parliamentary privilege. Parliamentary privilege is supposed to be about the proceedings of Parliament, and most people normally interpret that to mean debates and committee proceedings, not a workplace regulatory process. And as far as former Prime Minister Johnson is concerned, I hold no brief for him, and I have every respect for Harriet Harman, who chairs the Privileges Committee, but I think the question of the procedural propriety of that process is absolutely critical. It should be front and centre stage, and I would say that whether it was Boris Johnson being investigated or anybody else. Very often what you get in these processes, if I may say so, is tribalism. So you get people on the right attacking people they regard as opponents, and people on the left attacking people that they regard as opponents. So, for example, Priti Patel was accused of bullying. I'm not going to say whether I think Priti was guilty of bullying or not. I don't know. I can say only in my personal dealings with her, she was always unfailingly courteous. We always got on very well. I've no idea how she treated her staff, but there were suggestions that she was guilty of bullying. And there were people on the left who rushed to attack her, and there were people on the right who rushed to say, no, that's not true at all. She's just robust. She's just standing up to useless officials and making progress at the Home Office. But those people who were rushing to defend her, and I can think of a number of them, were very quick to round on me. Why? Well, because they liked Priti, but they didn't like me, just as there were people on the left who attacked her and stood up for me. So what I would say is let's try to depoliticise this and establish a proper process. All I would say is this on the bullying issue, beyond what I've already said. Look, I'm the father of 3 kids. I want my children to go in the workplace and not to be sworn up, not to be shouted at, not to be threatened, not to be intimidated, not to be bullied by being denied adequate work and then told, oh, well, you're surplus to requirements. In other words, not being frozen out and not being given so much work that they can't possibly cope, which again can be a form of bullying. I don't want any of my 3 kids, our 3 kids, to experience that. But I do think we're in some danger of getting to a point at which anybody who says, oh, well, I was offended by that, I feel very upset by what was said, or I didn't approve of being told I had to do X or Y or Z, all of a sudden can shout bullying. That's not right. This can't be accepted. I must be allowed to protest, etc. I would say to any manager in the private sector, the public sector, or the voluntary sector watching this programme, frankly, I'm concerned for you, because you should have the right to manage. And without going into the details, and I won't go into the details, and you wouldn't expect me to go into the details, I faced a situation where I wanted certain arrangements in my office, and I was told, no, you've got to agree to have X and Y removed from your office. And I said, no, I'm not agreeing to that. I'm not agreeing to that, and I must be allowed to decide who works in my office. And it was subsequently said, oh, well, because I had originally agreed to the idea of a change and changed my mind, which I did, I had every right, in my view, to change my mind, that caused great upset, and a working relationship never recovered, and the person concerned felt bullied. I'm sorry, but this is nonsense on stilts. It really is absurd. And the key point is, it wouldn't survive a moment's scrutiny in a court of law. Could the people investigating or adjudicating on these matters debate these points with me in open session in a court of law? They couldn't. They'd be ripped to shreds. And then what would happen? Then I'd be referred to the League Against Cruel Sports. You can't win. But it's a nonsense. It is an absolute nonsense. I'm flawed. I made mistakes. I didn't bully people. And, for some character who doesn't know me from Adam to come along and say, oh, well, I bullied people on a serious or serial basis or told lies, really is unadulterated piffle. I've got into trouble over the years for being too candid, but I have not told a single lie, not in that process and not in my political life at any other time. And if the bigot faction, who were arraigned against me and already decided what they wanted to find, if the bigot faction want to say, oh, well, he's a bully or he's a liar or whatever, they can, and they're entitled to their view, but they suffer from the very serious disadvantage of being completely 100% wrong.
Joining us again in the studio to discuss that exclusive interview about John Bercow is broadcast journalist and author Michael Crick. And what I want to go back to, Michael, was what I asked at the very beginning, and this is now with Boris Johnson going to be before that Privileges Committee. Would he be concerned about the process? And he said yes, because this is a big thing now coming forward for Boris Johnson.
Well, he's right to say that, John Bercow. It is hugely important that a potential re-Prime Minister and certainly a former Prime Minister is given, or indeed any MP, is given a fair process and given the opportunity to ask questions and question witnesses and so on. And he's absolutely, because if it's not fair and if it's perceived not to be fair and if it's perceived to be partisan, then problems will fester. And the resentment will continue. And so he's right on that front. But of course, he's trying to link Boris Johnson's case with his case and trying to make out that his case was partisan, which it was as well. It's clever what Bercow's doing here, but he's right on what he says on the Johnson case. In terms of bullying, it wasn't just partisan. It wasn't just the Labour Party defending him and Conservative MPs backing the people who complained about bullies. There wasn't just the people who would publicly accuse him of bullying, the parliamentary staff, who are not partisan, most of them, and of course anonymous voices as well. And indeed, I spoke to people who gave me very graphic descriptions, and I am left with the conclusion that yes, he was a bully. That there's so much evidence here, a wealth of evidence that he wasn't just chivying people along. And of course, one person's bullying can sometimes be somebody else's chivying. He was doing some pretty appalling things and treating staff and using sarcasm and shouting at people and throwing things. And this evidence is, there's a wealth of evidence out there about this. And I am left with the conclusion that he is a bully. But it's interesting also his tactics here. I remember going to a murder trial a few years ago, and I was astonished because the defendant confessed to everything apart from the murder. And in a way, that's what we're seeing today. In other words, he's confessed to all the other things in your interview, an extraordinary list, as I've said. But he's not confessing to this one big thing that is the huge black spot on his career.
What do you make of his defence?
But he'll also say, won't he, all those people remained with me. They were my staff from the start to the very end. If there had been a problem, they would have gone. So there's a lot of them.
But a lot of other people around him, and it wasn't just 3 or 4, if you add them all up. And he'll say, OK, yeah, but they're not public and all of this. But it is a problem. But I am left with the conclusion that he was a bully. And I'm reinforced in that view by his behaviour that was public, the way in which he did treat MPs in the House of Commons, which I think, there were occasions when that could have been described as bullying as well, although it's much more important when it's staff, because they're not in a position to answer back, whereas MPs are. And MPs, are used to the robust cut and thrust of public life. But I do think he was a bully, and I don't. We'll probably never get to the bottom of all this, but.
Did nothing he say there leave you with a slightly different impression? The thing about the fact that it was for the issue from years ago and no other witnesses to the event were interviewed. Does that not make you change your stance at all, or are you still left with the same impression?
I am left with the same impression, and I mean, yes, there will be evidence from years ago, and there'll be evidence that's more recent. And of course, there will be incidents where there are only two people in the room and it's one person against another. But I think that when you have so many people who are, you know, the people who work in Parliament and work for the Speaker are highly intelligent people. They're not partisan people. They're not. And I think that their views are worth listening to. They may not all be telling the truth, but I think there are so many of them and their descriptions are so vivid that there is a problem there. And I think if all of this evidence was laid out before a jury, John Bercow would be convicted.
It's interesting, loads of views still coming in and we still want to hear from everybody, but Richard from Coventry said, appreciate it's good to look at both sides of the argument, however, John Bercow is trying to justify his appalling behaviour as Speaker, and so he sees it like that. Then I've got Teresa who says, I so love Bercow as Speaker. Yes, he was loud, but I loved his theatrical vocabulary. Maybe the theatre should have been his way to go when retiring as Speaker. He's still got plenty of time to do that. I think the fact that he takes an interest in ordinary people makes him a good man, and that's what Teresa said.
And Jake says, which reinforces a bit of what John Bercow said, he said, I think John was a great Speaker of the House, but will never forgive him for moving to Labour. So maybe that's what
tribalness that he did talk about.
Do you think there is an element of that people are judging him not on his behaviour as Speaker, but on his political journey, so to speak? Is there anything in that?
Yes, and I mean, it's a complex picture, and people's characters are. I mean, I write about a lot of people, and several of the people I've written about, Alex Ferguson, Geoffrey Archer, Nigel Farage, and I'd put Bercow in this category, are what I call charming monsters. But when they're charming and self-deprecating, as we've seen with Bercow, you know, he's very persuasive, and you think, what a nice man. But then you see there's another side to their characters, and you think, what a horrible man. And it's this combination, and I think actually about 2/3 of high achievers, you know, and you put Hitler and Stalin into this as well.
Oh, blooming heck.
2/3 of high achievers are this combination of ultimate charm. And when they're charming, they're really, really charming. And when they're horrid, and I could use a word, but I better not, they really, really are vile. And it's that combination that is often so successful, I'm afraid, in this world. And
so complicated character, and all of the things that you said that he did modernise the House. Maybe this person who was driving this forward, whether he did it sometimes wrong, but he needed to drive it forward. Otherwise, it would never have changed and been modernised. I think we've probably got to move on to the next bit.
Yeah, let's return to our exclusive interview with John Bercow after this break, and we'll be talking to him about Brexit, so don't go anywhere.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. It's nearly 20 past 11. Your views are coming in thick and fast still. Keep them coming in too.
Yeah, Oliver from Kent says the look on both of your presenter faces suggests Bercow's bluster was not working. So tiresome listening to this man.
And Katie says, I'm really surprised to see the casual chat with the most undemocratic speaker in history gloating about his bullying manner, but that's OK because he sometimes got it wrong. Boris sometimes got it wrong. Look what happened to him. And look what maybe is about to happen to him. Bercow was completely biased and should have been thrown out the country, voted Brexit. He tried to overturn that. I don't think he'll ever be forgiven for that, the Brexit.
Which we're going to come on to.
Which we're going to come on to.
Jill says Bercow was an infuriating speaker, in my opinion.
And James says, John Bercow was anything but impartial. Bring back Betty Boothroyd. She was brilliant. And Kamal and Kent said he was a good speaker, a good orator and a good communicator. We need people like him in politics to add glamour sometimes to the boring debates.
And Jenny says there are two sides to every story and somewhere in the middle sits the truth. I do, though, think it's a shame that someone with such a wonderful grasp of the English language isn't in the Lords. So thank you for your views. Keep them coming. Let's now return to that interview with John Bercow as we ask him about his impartiality during Brexit.
Definitely one controversial aspect when you're a speaker has to be the Brexit period.
That's true.
And for a lot of people, they felt that you weren't impartial, that you weren't the referee, that actually you were thwarting the Brexit debate and you'd come on side of the Remain side. So what do you have to say about that?
What I say about that is that I was on the side of Parliament, Esther. Philip came to see me, absolutely typical of him, and I've always respected him for that, to say, Mr. Speaker, I'll go on supporting you. I think I'm quoting him correctly. I've always supported you. I will continue to support you because I think you're a good speaker, but I think you ought to be aware there are colleagues of mine who are saying that they think you're making the wrong decisions and that you are either deliberately or in effect siding against Brexit.
Or contriving with the Remainers.
Or contriving with the Remainers. No, I always saw anybody who wanted to come to see me. So at one point, there was a bit of speculation in the media about whether I'd seen Dominic Grieve. Well, Dominic Grieve on one occasion asked to see me and I saw him. Oliver Letwin on one occasion asked to see me and I saw him. John Redwood asked to see me and I saw him. And Philip asked to see me and I saw him. So there's absolutely no significance in that at all. The Speaker generally sees people who want to see the Speaker, to raise a point, to make an observation, to run an idea by and say, is it all right if I do this or that? There's nothing unusual about that. No, what I would say is this. When the Brexiteers were in a minority, in fact, Esther, Philip, before the word Brexit had been invented, I was awarding urgent questions to Eurosceptics when David Cameron was Prime Minister, because I felt that that then minority view, but large minority view in the Conservative Party, needed to be heard. And on one occasion, controversially, but in my opinion rightly, I selected the so-called Barron Amendment. John Barron, colleague of yours you know very well, he had tabled an amendment to the Queen's speech in 2013. I had advice against selecting it, but I decided to select that amendment, not least because it was heavily signed. It had way over 100 signatures, if I remember rightly. But anyway, it certainly had a large number of signatures. And I felt, let it be debated and voted upon. And it was. Now, the government wasn't very pleased about that, but I thought that was the right thing to do.
So an enabler of Brexit at that time?
Well, Brexit wasn't a Conservative manifesto proposal at that point, but Esther, you're teasing me and you're trying to wind me up here, but there's a sense in which you're right. There are people who say that it started the process whereby the Conservative Party ultimately committed to a referendum on Brexit. And I think another factor was a backbench business committee debate, which Philip will remember very well, in the name of David Nuttall, Conservative member in Bury, and the government won the vote, but there was a very large number of Conservative rebels, over 80 or 81 if I remember rightly, and I think I chaired that debate and so on. So a number of those things were thought to be part of the process whereby the Conservative Party's position on Brexit gradually shifted, and Cameron said, well, yes, let's have a referendum on the subject. So I was fair to those people at that time, and I don't recall Bill Cash or Bernard Jenkin or John Barron, any of those people, complaining about the fact that I was granting their urgent questions. When I did the same years later for Justine Greening, Dominic Grieve, Oliver Letwin, Sam Gyimah and so on, Bernard, I think, at one point stood up and started grumbling about it. And I would argue that what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Bear in mind two things. First of all, after 2016, I know that's sort of the end of history as far as some Brexiteers are concerned, there had been a general election in 2017 and the Conservatives had lost their majority. And the second thing is that because the Conservatives had lost their majority, we didn't for sure know what the will of the House was. So my attitude, you may think this was wrong, but my attitude was the form that Brexit takes and whether it happens at all is still in play. It's still a matter for the House to decide how to proceed. The public answered the question, should we stay or should we leave? And they answered the question, we should leave. But they didn't answer whether we should stay in the customs union or the single market or what form Brexit should take. They just said Brexit should go ahead. The House was then gridlocked because there was no clear decision as to what form Brexit should take. I made the decision, which apparently was very controversial, that there was nothing set in stone about the idea that the government had to control the order paper every day. And I had advice from the clerks that if people who were
This was particularly controversial.
Yeah, if people who weren't sympathetic to the government's position, and in particular who were worried about the possibility of a no-deal Brexit, of a kind of ejection from the passenger seat of the plane, on the 31st of October 2019, they should be allowed to try, through parliamentary proceedings and manoeuvres, to prevent that. And I said, yes, you can try that. I took advice from a senior clerk, and he said, Mr. Speaker, we're in uncharted waters. There's no absolute rule about this. It is true that, generally speaking, the government controls the order paper. And that had been true, not for hundreds of years, for about the last 100 years. But it isn't an inviolable rule. It's up to you as to whether you allow Mr. Letwin and Mr. Burt and Mr. Hilary Benn to challenge that. And Yvette Cooper, I think, and I decided to allow that to be challenged. And the government didn't like that. Well, my feeling was, well, where does it say that that can't happen? It's up to you. I said to Julian Smith, the chief whip at the time, if you don't like it, it's up to you to vote it down. Now, I accept that that was unpopular. It's just a matter of fact. It was unpopular with a great many people on the Conservative benches. I felt it was up to the government either to have the numbers to win the votes or to stop being moaning minis. When it is suggested that it was because I'd taken sides, I totally reject that. My attitude was if Brexit went ahead, which in the end it did, fine, if that's the decision of Parliament. And of course, in the end it did, because Boris Johnson perfectly legitimately decided to try to get the support of the House for an election, and he won the support of the House for an election, and he said at that election, get Brexit done. I personally think it's been very bad for the country, but do I accept that as a result of winning that mandate, he was absolutely entitled then to proceed with Brexit? Absolutely.
Well, there were people on the Remain side who I did convey this to you at the time, who were in the tea room would say, we're going to stop Brexit because we've got the Speaker on our side. Now you might say, well, they were wrong, But is it not even a failing that they even thought that you were on their side in that sense, in a way that the Speaker shouldn't be on anybody's side? And there was a feeling that you were changing the rules of the game midway through the game. That, you know, we all thought we were playing to these rules. Then all of a sudden, the referee came along and said, "Oh, actually, the rules that you thought we were playing are now no longer the rules. We're now playing to different rules." And that again was an unacceptable position for the Speaker to be in.
Well, I think there are two answers to that. First of all, I don't think I can be held responsible for what I regard as the institutionalised gossip factory of the House of Commons. In other words, people constantly talk in the tea rooms, and they often speculate, and they give the impression they know more than they do. I've no idea who it was who was saying, well, you know, we're going to stop Brexit because we've got the Speaker on our side. It may just be, Philip, and you've got a good sense of humour, and I say the same to Esther, it may just be that those people are trying to wind you up. What I can do is look you in the eye and look your viewers in the eye and say, I did not say or imply to any parliamentary colleague on any occasion, anywhere, that I wanted to help them stop Brexit. I didn't regard that as my job. I will be 100% candid with you and say that I did think that it was perfectly legitimate for MPs opposed to a no-deal Brexit, and you know that Oliver Letwin, for example, was in that category. He was a Remainer, but he had voted, I think, 3 times for the May deal because he felt that it was better to have a deal than not, and he wanted to try to respect the result of the referendum. I did think it was perfectly legitimate for people like Oliver Letwin, Dominic Grieve, and others, Yvette Cooper, etc., to try to act in Parliament to ensure that there was a decision by the House on a no-deal Brexit. You will remember that Theresa May took the view that it was important for her negotiating position, and Boris Johnson took the same view on that, whatever other differences they had. It was important for their negotiating position that they should be able to dangle that prospect, that if they didn't get a deal, well, we'll just come out on the 31st. And there were people who said to me, Mr. Speaker, we regard it as unacceptable that the government should be able to use the power of government and the control of the order paper to stop us forcing a vote on that matter. I very politely suggest that I think that both of those prime ministers knew that if there was a vote of the House, those supporting a no-deal Brexit would be in a minority. So I felt it was perfectly legitimate for that to be debated and voted on by the House. Forgive me, Philip, what was the other part of that question? There were 2 parts to that question. One.
No, that was it. That was what people were saying in the tea room, but also that you were changing the rules midway through through the game.
Well, the notion that I was changing the rules midway through the game, there was no precedent of which I was aware for quite the situation we were in. So
in that regard, you were then. If you're saying there's no precedent, that meant you could change the rules as you went along.
I don't think it's a question of changing the rules. I think it's deciding what's legitimate in those circumstances. If there had been a precedent that said, you know, under no circumstances can you allow there to be a vote on the standing order that gives the government control of the order paper, well, then I would have been breaking the rules. There was no such rule at all. There was a standing order that said ordinarily, you know, other than on days that are specified for other purposes, the government controls the order paper. But of course, the point was, Esther, there was a proposition to the House that that standing order be suspended. Now, you can only have a vote on whether a standing order be suspended if you allow a vote to be had, and you can only allow a vote to be had if you allow a proposition to be tabled. In a sense, what the government was arguing was that vote should not be allowed to happen, whereas my view was, I don't know whether the House is going to vote for the retention of the standing order and government control or for the suspension of the standing order and the assertion of an independent view. We were in uncharted territory, but I think the fact we're in uncharted territory means it's not really fair to say that I was creating a new rule. I was deciding in a new situation what seemed reasonable in terms of the rights of Parliament. Now, I completely accept, Esther, Philip, I completely accept that there were people who will strongly disagree with me. I accept that. What I would ask is people might consider accepting. The keyboard warriors never do, because they prefer abrasiveness and instant judgmentalism and ferocious personal attacks and so on. It's all very down-market stuff. What I would ask is that people accept that I was behaving honestly. Now, I think I was behaving honestly and correctly. You may think I was behaving honestly and incorrectly, but what I don't accept is that I was somehow behaving with a sort of messianic view to stopping or corrupting Brexit. I was not.
Wow, well, I stopped Phil short there before he asked another cracking question. If only I had that power in real life. It's great that I can do it in the editing suite. But I wanted to pause there so that we can ask Michael Crick whether he thinks Bercow was impartial during that Brexit debate.
I don't really, no. I mean, I'm a Remainer. I was then and I still am. But I do think that Bercow was a huge asset to the Remain side, and you talk to Remainers, and they talk, as Phil suggested in the interview, you talk to Remainers, and they talk about him as being, one of us, and he's going to help us. That sort of attitude. And what would be interesting to know, I mean, Bercow's argument is, look, I was advised by the clerks, the senior clerks, that I could do this and could do that, and precedent wasn't clear and so on. It would be interesting to know what the senior clerks really were advising him. And we probably never will know, and I don't even know whether, any documentation ever gets published or whether that only applies to governments and not to the advice the Speaker gets. The other problem was that it got to the stage where the Labour Party, was so pleased that the Speaker seemed to be on their side that it all got mixed up with the bullying issue. And so therefore you had Labour, who after all, it's in the name, are meant to be the party in defence of the of workers and parliamentary workers who are included. And there was they should be hot on bullying, and they were sort of, turning a blind eye to this bullying stuff. And, they weren't helpful in terms of trying to pursue the whole bullying issue against Bercow, and they were really coming to his defence. And that, to me, is quite telling, that they regarded Bercow, they turned a blind eye, basically, to the accusations of bullying against Bercow because they wanted him to remain Speaker in order to achieve the right outcome.
I think some of them said that overtly, didn't they? I think some of them actually...
I think you're right.
I think some of them actually said that was one thing, but it was more important he stayed there about Brexit.
Didn't Margaret Beckett say something like that?
I thought it was Margaret Beckett, but I didn't want to say so in case I was...
Yeah, well, we may be wrong, but no doubt she'll let us know.
Again, he was sort of saying, because nobody had definitively said no,
yes,
I was going to push the boundaries. I let him finish everything that he was saying there, and in the House at the time, everybody could see that. And I remember writing an article at the time about Oliver Letwin, because this was the brains behind it, who was looking, and I said, what you have done is unforgivable, to be moving the agenda and allowing, government to lose the order paper. Now, the only reason I bring that up right now with you, how important was that this week, when really that precipitated Liz Truss's downfall, that the opposition took the order paper over, supposedly on a fracking debate, but it fundamentally does shift the dynamics and balance in the House and can create all sort of chaos, not just Brexit there, but the falling now of a Prime Minister.
Well, my view is that overall, it's right that the government shouldn't control the order paper as much as they used to, and it's right that the Parliament, if there is a majority the other way, should be able to get much more involved in the agenda. And, up until Bercow's time, the government was too much in charge of Parliament, and Parliament wasn't effective. So it's incredibly complicated. All this procedural stuff is incredibly complicated. But I do think Parliament is well, the House of Commons bit anyway, is a much stronger institution than it was 12 years ago. And I think that's good news, and Bercow has played a role in that. But the Bercow record is far from perfect, is my conclusion. Goodness knows what he's going to say next time I bump into him.
Michael, thank you for that. Coming up after the break, it's time for the final part of that exclusive interview with former Speaker John Bercow, so don't go anywhere.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back. It's 11:38 now. Let's move on to the final part of our interview with John Bercow, where we continue our conversation about Brexit impartiality.
I guess people say, well, it was just very convenient that the rules you decided to apply were ones that suited your own personal opinion about Brexit. That's the
right. Okay, but if on the other hand, okay, Philip, but if on the other hand I had decided, right, well, I might be accused of making a judgment on the basis of my view, therefore I'll do the opposite, that would have meant closing down the very opportunity for parliamentary independence, which would otherwise be championed by the honourable gentleman, the member for Shipley, and indeed by the right honourable member for Tatton.
The other thing is, this is another area where people say, well, you were making these decisions to please Sally.
Oh.
Is there anything in that at all?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, look, you know, the Conservative Party has never been very comfortable with me having a spouse who holds views against them. She was sometimes very outspoken in making clear her hostility to the Conservative Party, and one could argue the toss about whether she should have done that or not. I always defended her, but in any case, this is an interview of me, not of her. But I remember once, Philip, I say this good-naturedly, in my own constituency, there was a local member who wrote to me to say she was most perturbed to read that Sally might be seeking to become a Labour Member of Parliament. And she thought that this would be most improper. And she wrote me a letter saying, I have always believed that a husband and wife should face the world together. And I wrote back to this woman and said, dear Caroline, I note your views, forgive me, but I would like to respond equally robustly. When you say that you don't think it is right that the wife of the Speaker should be a Member of Parliament, I think what you really mean is you don't think it's right that she should be a Labour Member of Parliament. I don't think you'd be objecting if she was a Conservative Member of Parliament. And I would very gently remind you, Esther, as a North West MP, that one of your predecessors in the North West, the member for Macclesfield, was of course Nicholas Winterton. Well, Nicholas Winterton stood for election as Speaker in 2000, and then again when I stood successfully in 2009. And on both occasions that he stood, his wife was a Member of Parliament. Now, I don't remember anybody saying, oh, well, we can't have Winterton as Speaker because Anne's a member and he'll be biased in favour. So, this is nonsense. What it was that the Tory party didn't like the fact that Sally was a lefty. And so, look, I mean, that is part of the prejudice. They didn't like the fact that she was a lefty.
But you like stoking
there were plenty of Conservatives who didn't like the fact that I was lower class. One of them described me as an oik, an exceptionally stupid Conservative member of Parliament who is no longer in the House of Commons, said to a mutual friend, he didn't realise he was talking to a friend of mine, he said, trouble with Bercow is that I don't want to be unkind about it, the trouble with Bercow is he's an oik. And can I say to you as a friend, that, you know, when the Labour Party got the Speaker, one sort of rather expects probably a working class chap or a working class woman as a Speaker. But when we, the Conservatives, have the chair, we sort of want to have a gentleman in the chair. And the trouble with Bercow is he's an oik. So there was a bit of that, and then there was the Conservative MP who is no longer in the House, who said to me at a very early stage, Bercow, if I had my way, people like you wouldn't be in this place. And I said, when you say people like me, do you mean because I'm lower class or because I'm Jewish? To which, without a moment's hesitation, he replied, both. So neither of you has ever treated me with anything other than courtesy, friendliness and warmth. And whatever our political differences, we've always got on very well. But I was on the receiving end of a great deal of prejudice.
From that now, and people would say definitely with the smashing of the red wall and the blue wall, surely things have moved on the
I would hope
class
so.
front, on every other front.
Esther, I would hope so. I mean, the honest answer is I would very much hope so. Don't forget, I'm not in the House. You know, not only, as your viewers will be aware, I'm no longer the Speaker, but I'm not a Member of Parliament anymore. So if I'm really candid with you, I don't know about the 2019 intake. I mean, I know I'm aware of some of them, but I don't know.
But you think there's still a class problem in politics?
I think it's a much lesser problem than it used to be. But I think there's still, to be honest, there's still quite a lot of snobbery in society. I wouldn't just say in politics. I would say across society there's still quite a lot of snobbery. And one point that I think, you know, we perhaps would all agree on, it's not quite what you're asking me about, but I'm sort of trying in a sense to meet you halfway for all the things we might disagree about or you might object to my position on or feel you've got to ask me about. I think one thing we'd probably agree on is that whatever the merits, and I think there are very great merits in trying to get more women into Parliament and more ethnic minorities and more people who've experienced disability and so on, there's a lot to be said for having a lot more people from ordinary backgrounds in Parliament, a lot more people from working class communities. And, you know, why should it always be people who've had the top jobs? You know, people often say, oh, it'd be good to have more doctors in Parliament. Well, it'd also be good to have more nurses in Parliament. Or it might be good to have more head teachers in Parliament. It might be good to have more teachers in Parliament. And it might be good to have some bus drivers in Parliament and so on. You know, I would like to see a much more eclectic mix. I think we have made, to be honest, big progress, and I think both parties have made big progress. I think that when you're a representative of a minority, which I was, from the Jewish community, the truth of the matter is that if you're a conformist in the Conservative Party, you're fine. The Conservative Party has always embraced minorities who conform. But if you, in a sense, buck the trend and you're a bit independent-minded and you're inclined to pipe up for yourself, sometimes with discordant tunes, that's when the hostility starts. And I did get quite regular representations from people with profoundly bigoted views, which I proceeded to ignore.
Just a final question. When you look back at your time as Speaker of the House of Commons, what are you most proud of, and what would you consider to be your biggest mistake?
Philip, the thing I'm most proud of is empowering backbenchers, granting more urgent questions, granting emergency debates, granting more opportunities per se for MPs to question the Prime Minister and other ministers. I remember on one occasion, and it became quite a trend, but I remember on one occasion early on when I overran Prime Minister's questions, not least because the Prime Minister, David Cameron, had given quite full responses. I'm not sure I would call them answers, but he'd given quite full responses. And I overran by, at the time, what seemed to him to be an unacceptable 5 minutes. It got longer than that in subsequent years, as you know. And as he left the chamber, he rather waspishly said to me, Mr. Speaker, I do have a plane to catch, you know. And I said, yes, but with great respect, Prime Minister, it is your own plane. It's not going to go without you. And I think the rights of the House are important. So I'm very proud of the fact that I gave MPs more opportunity to speak up, including people with minority viewpoints. I remember Nadine Dorries once saying to me, You know, I've been so pleased that you gave me my head on the subject of same-sex marriage and on abortion. I thought you'd be biased. And I said, Nadine, I always tried to persuade you that when you become the Speaker, you've got to allow all points of view to be heard. So I think I am very proud of the fact that I said I would be a champion of backbenchers, and I was a champion of backbenchers. What was my biggest mistake? Well, I don't know how long we've got. I made several. But I think that one big mistake I made, which probably isn't known to members of the public on any scale that you know about, Philip, was I mishandled the recruitment of the clerk in 2014. I felt I had a very good argument for splitting the roles of clerk and chief executive, which eventually did happen, because on the law of averages, is it likely that the principal constitutional advisor to the Speaker and the House, namely the Clerk of the House, would also top the class at the Harvard Business School? It's not very likely. And I took the view, well, let's have someone in charge of procedure, but that person shouldn't also be the chief executive if that person's got very little experience of the commercial sector and of how to manage things. And I tried to create a split, but I did it on the back of too little consultation. I did it in a rather hurried and maladroit fashion, and it caused ill feeling in the House, and I then had to backtrack. So I got my way eventually on the splitting of the two roles, but I handled it spectacularly badly. So that was one quite significant mistake. I don't believe in the death penalty, and even if I did, I don't think that it's a hanging offence, but I did make a mess of it.
John Bercow, thank you very much for your time and for your candour. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're back in the studio here with Michael Crick. A couple of things I wanted to bring out there, and this really was the snobbery within politics and within Parliament. I mean, he'd taken some harsh comments, hadn't he? He was an oik. They didn't like that he was doing. So, chip on his shoulder, or is there genuine snobbery still in politics?
I think there is genuine, you know, and people would they'd attack him. They'd call him an oik. They'd make jokes about his size, the fact that he's not very tall. You know, jokes about being a dwarf and so on. And yeah, there is snobbery in politics, but nothing like as much as there used to be. You know, when there was a time when the Conservative benches were full of public school boys, people with military backgrounds, upper-class backgrounds, aristocratic backgrounds. It's very different now. But he's absolutely right, I think, about the whole diversity thing when it comes to class. And there are very few members of Parliament these days that you can say are genuinely working class, not whose parents were miners or factory workers, but who themselves have been coal miners or call centre workers. Or, you know, had low-paid jobs or postmen or whatever. I mean, there's a few, probably more actually, on your side.
Side. So you'd say Scott Mann, or Lee Anderson.
Lee Anderson, who was a coal miner, and Scott Mann, who was a postman. But I'm not on the Labour side, and it's partly because it's so expensive to become an MP these days. Becoming a candidate and then being a prospective candidate for several years is really, really expensive.
Or in my case, 10 years. Right. So it's a long time that you've got to
have to depend on your spouse's income, and there are lots of people who just simply can't afford it. And I study parliamentary selections a lot at the moment, and I look at the Labour have chosen about 3 dozen so far, and really there's only a couple there that you could say do working class jobs. The rest are, on the whole, university educated. Nothing wrong with that, but what's wrong with it is that they're all of the same kind of backgrounds.
Is the media the same? Is this the same snobbery in the media in your experience?
There is a snobbery in the media, and it will be more of an intellectual snobbery, I suppose, amongst broadcast.
Is that a snobbery in itself? Whilst we've got snobbery, you've got intellectual snobbery. You've fitted that perfectly well there, Michael.
But I mean, the other problem he rose that arises from all this is, he talks about how it's perfectly reasonable. My wife should have want to be a Labour MP, say, or have a sticker on her car. The trouble is that this is a problem that doesn't just arise for the Speaker of the House of Commons. It arises. Would the Cabinet Secretary be happy if their spouse had a vote Labour or a vote Conservative, put up a vote Labour or vote Conservative poster in their house? Would the political editor of the BBC be happy if that happened? There are certain jobs where you have to, persuade your family that, please, you can't put up an election poster. You can't let it be known that that you're partisan, because that undermines me in my role. And it's unfortunate. And, you know, we obviously need to encourage spouses to go for the jobs that they want and they have. But there are certain circumstances where you've got to say, look, if you put up that, you know, you may say it to your daughter, if you put up that vote communist poster in the window, that is going to be, and it's spotted, it's going to be hugely damaging.
So, Michael, just as we come to the end of the show, obviously we're not as skillful interrogators as you, but what's your overall impression of the interview and John Bercow after that interview?
Well, I think you should have been a bit harder on him when it came to the bullying stuff, because I think there were, you should have got into the detail of what people had been saying. I think I would have hurled that at him if I'd been doing it. But I think the format is wonderful. I think you've had and this way of dice, 5 minutes. Then what do you think of that? What do we think of that? And then you go. I think it really works as a format, and I don't think I've seen it before on television already. And I hope you'll use it.
I'll take full credit for that one. So thank you. And it is also anybody else, any other TV presenters or anybody else thinking of stealing it, don't. You've got to come for me first. It's been copywritten.
Anyway, I hope your producer should put that interview in for one of the awards that if they're going to give awards to GB News.
We've already had one. Eamon Holmes has already had one, hasn't he? Top presenter.
I've got to be careful because I'm sometimes a judge on these things. But the other thing I'd say, just watching you, Philip, maybe you should go for Speaker of the House of Commons at the next time round. But is that? I don't know. You thinking of it?
No. But I'll tell you one thing, and you will know this to be true. There is very few people in the House of Parliament who understand process. You'd probably say there's a handful out of the 650 people, and Philip is one of those. I always say this, he's an anorak, he loves process, he loves all of that. So, yes, you're quite right, it would be something.
But can you remember who everybody is? Because that's the astonishing thing that Bercow could do.
Yeah, amazing.
And I can never do. I mean, I know who they are, but I can't remember the name,
Philip does know that. But I think Bercow's it is photographic.
Notice you're not ruling it out, by the way, either.
No, I am ruling it out. Don't worry, I am ruling it out.
He is, but he would have done that. But going back to Bercow, he has got a photographic memory. You can see his recalling of names, of instances, of times, of dates. Lots of these things I thought might have come through in the interview. As I said, his single-mindedness, his doggedness. I did think he had a chip on his shoulder for various things. But then that made him more motivated. And maybe that sort of anger became his energy that allowed him to stride through, which goes back to your point about a complicated character.
Now, the one thing, I mean, you saw it a couple of times in the interview, was his mimicking people.
Yes.
He's a very good mimic.
Here's a suggestion for your Christmas show. Bring him back for half an hour or something and get him, because he does everybody, and he does them brilliantly. And I've never seen him do a TV, I'm persuading, just maybe only 15 minutes, but he can do everybody in politics.
He is a very good mimic.
And it's so funny when he does.
Now, while we've got you here, very, very quickly, one-word answer, who's going to be the next Prime Minister?
Oh, put you on the spot there.
Sunak, I hope. And Sunak, I think, and Sunak, I hope.
You don't think Boris will get 100 and get to the members and they'll vote?
Well, I think he might. And the problem is, once he gets to 100 members and... I don't know,
he's sitting on the fence now. After being a different answer, he's sitting on the fence.
I'm sorry, but if you're putting a gun to my head, I would say Sunak. But I think Boris Johnson coming back would be an absolute disaster.
Michael Crick, you have been fantastic. Thank you for joining us today. Look, I hope you've enjoyed that special. Don't go anywhere, because next is Alistair Stewart and Friends.
Good morning. I'm Alex Deakin with your weekend weather forecast from the Met Office. The mild weather continues, as do the showers, but I don't think there'll be too many showers today across England and Wales. We'll be between these two weather systems. This one is still providing some showery rain across Scotland and Northern Ireland, and this one approaching, bringing some more rain tonight and tomorrow. But let's get back to Saturday. That first weather system still bringing outbreaks of rain across southern and central Scotland and Northern Ireland this morning, slowly pushing to the north, so it will brighten up, I suspect, in Belfast and eventually through the central belt of Scotland. Some brighter spells in the far northwest, but quite misty, murky conditions around the northeast. For most of England and Wales, it's a fine Saturday. The sunshine may turn a little hazy across the south, and later on there will be a few showers, but generally dry and really quite mild. 18, 19 Celsius with a bit of sunshine. The showers will return to Devon and Cornwall this evening and across parts of Wales and then they'll become more extensive overnight. Some bright colours there as well, some heavy downpours. They do tend to move through, but nevertheless, say some heavy rain at times, and another batch of heavy rain then comes into Wales and parts of southern England overnight. Another pretty mild night, although perhaps a little cooler than the night just gone over northern England and southern Scotland. Into Sunday, and this line of rain will make for a very wet start through parts of Wales, the Midlands and southeast England, and it marches northwards into parts of Northern Ireland, across northern England, and eventually into southern and then central Scotland by the end of the day. Behind that, brighter skies for a time for Wales, the Midlands and southern England, but also more showers follow on behind that. Could be some rumbles of thunder almost at any time through the weekend. But throughout, it also stays mild, with temperatures, when it brightens up again, getting into the high teens. If you're on half term next week, then, well, it's going to stay mild, but it's also staying showery and often with gusty winds.
Join me, Nana Akua, on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today.
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled.